The Lord be with you. Thanks for joining our King of Glory family as we read through Genesis. So I thought I'd give some helpful hints and advice on reading Genesis. So I'm going to put this in the side notes, what I'm, at least the outline of what I'm going through here, in case you have any questions. Or you can always type them below. I will always respond. I think I'll always respond. So the first thing we've got to do is make sure we realize this was written 3,300 years ago in the ancient Near East. It was not written by people who knew about modern science and modern scientific techniques, and they had radically different questions. And so we're going to get into that a little bit. So I want to start with a C.S. Lewis quotation. He says, there was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries were the high noon of magic. The serious magical endeavors and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died. The other strong and throve, but they were twins. They were both born of the same impulse. And so he's talking about the development of science in the 16th and 17th century, and C.S. Lewis is saying, yeah, that's magic. The scientific endeavor is magic. It's the same endeavor. There is something which unites magic and applied science, which, while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. Let me read that again. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of human beings. The solution is a technique, and both in the practice of this technique, both magic and science, are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. Well, of course, it's science. And so, the difference when we're reading Genesis is if we come at this with a scientific point of view, we're basically coming with a flawed point of view. Nothing against the scientific method. I'm really talking about the philosophy behind science here, not the scientific method itself, though, as C.S. Lewis points out, it's flawed at the very root. All scientific methodology is flawed at its root. And so if I could describe, the difference, science seeks to explain and control. And what Genesis is doing is saying that this is for humans so that they can continue God's work of creation. And it's a radically different point of view. From the scientific point of view, they're trying to figure out, okay, how did we originate? How did we get here so that we can control things? But in the end, human beings are in accident, a byproduct. That is, the universe doesn't care about you, according to science, and the universe was not made for you, according to science. You're just a byproduct, in accidents, a random happening. For the Bible, it's very much different. And so it's important as we read this. Okay, so let's start with story. You're reading a story, so read it as a story, or if you want, read it as literature. But I'm going to say read it as a story. It is history. It does talk about our actual origins. This is actual history, though because we've read it scientifically, we tend to read the story wrongly. So pay attention to what it actually says. This is why I translated 1 and 2 myself, was because I was seeing things that the other translations weren't helping me see. So history, it actually happened. Example and archetype. So history, these are actual origins, actually things that happened. They're examples. We want to learn from the characters. Notice there's very little in the way of description. We don't know, eye color and height and skin color. We don't know their language. We don't know what these people looked like at all. We know very little about what's going on as far as motivations or emotions. When we read that Cain was angry and downcast, that's really rare, but we're not told why. And for that, we kind of have this choose your own adventure about the Bible. So whether you read Adam as being with Eve, Adam, she gave some to her husband who was with her. Whether Adam was with her in the sense of right there watching the temptation narrative, or whether she brought some to him later because he was with her in the garden, is something you want to look at for yourself. What was going on in Eve's mind? What was going on in Adam's mind? What was the challenge? What was it that they were led to do, and why? And so we want to look at that. Same thing with Cain. What was going through his mind as he was offering the fruit of the ground? Different explanations for it. Same thing with each of the characters as we get into the story of Abraham. What's going through his mind? What's going on in his own personal history? And we want to learn from their examples, much as we learn from our own history and our own experience. And then the third way of reading story, archetype. That is what is true of Adam and Eve is true of us. And this is important, especially in my notes, that we read it as a story, because what is true of Adam and Eve is true of us. Eve is the mother of all the living. So is every woman. Adam is the human. So is every man. And Adam and Eve together, husband and wife, the one flesh union, are a story of God's rule and God's reign here on earth, and how man and wife, husband and wife, or human and life join together to correspond and help fulfill God's purposes and God's plan. And so some of the statements I make, that Adam and Eve were not immortal. That's a Greek idea, but that it very clearly says, if you read it the same way I do, that God made Adam mortal. He was dust, and he would return to the dust apart from the tree of life. And so the consequence of his rebellion is being banished from the tree of life, which was to say, you're under the sentence of death. You will certainly die because I'm going to cut you off from the tree of life. And guess what? You're mortal. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay, so that's all reading it as story, history, example, and archetype. Next, 1:1, the heavens and the earth. Again, this statement, I think, has caused great confusion because of our scientific reading, why I translate it as skies and land. Because when you hear, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and you're thinking of a big planet, a globe hanging out in the middle of the solar system. And if that's your picture, it's wrong. You've got to think in terms of a human being standing on the ground, standing on the land, and looking up at the blue sky. That's the picture we've got to read Genesis 1 as. And along those lines, create, the word create. We tend to, again, look at it. There's a scientific phrase from the Latin that God created ex nihilo, out of nothing, which is most certainly true. But Genesis 1 is not about an ex nihilo, out of nothing creation. And I can't emphasize how important this is to reading Genesis, is that we understand the origin story is not out of nothing. Again, I'm talking about Genesis 1. Yes, God created everything, but Genesis 1 says that he created out of darkness and the land, which was already there in Genesis 1, verse 2. And I'll get to why this is so important. So the word create, notice what he is doing. What God is doing is not taking nothing and creating something. He is ordering things, giving them name and purpose. That's what the word create actually means in Genesis 1 and 2. God is naming things and giving things purpose, and it's all for the purpose of creating humans to be his image on the earth. Okay, so that's really important. Genesis 1 verse 2, I cannot overestimate the importance of this verse because it's the starting point of creation. That is, the land, the land, that's the soil beneath your feet, it was covered in water and it was covered in darkness. It was unordered and it was uninhabitable, without form and void, void of life. It was lifeless, but not only was it lifeless, life couldn't live on it because it was unordered. Okay, that's what the formless part means. It was kind of like a watery desert, right? Okay, so that's the starting point. If you want, you can call it chaos. I'm hesitant to use that word, but non-ordered. Okay, 1 verse 2, because what's going to happen is that we're going to have a continual return with human rebellion to uninhabitable and unordered. Okay, that's what sin does. That's what rebellion does. It turns God's good creation into unordered and uninhabitable creation, right? Very good. So also with the word good, you're going to see some of the things are called good and some of the things are not called good. 10 things are called good. I think 10 times he says the word good. And so as you read, pay attention. What does he call good? Because there's some things that are not called good. And this again, I think is so important. When God calls Adam and Eve, calls human beings to subdue the creation, creation is good for human and animal habitation. We need things like night and day. Note the things he names. We need things like night and day. We need things like land and water. We need things like vegetation. Okay, we need animals. This is all good for human habitation and life. But there's more to God's good creation that still needs to go on. It isn't an idyllic place that God created. We think, oh, God created everything good, and so it was idyllic. It was like living on a South Island beach, and turtles brought you Mai Tais, and I don't know, what's that fish that you don't cook that you eat? Yeah, that. It's not like that. Instead, there are indicators that there's more to go with ordering of creation when God says subdue it. So in other words, there's darkness, which is not called good. There's still a sea, which, and there's a sea monster, and then there's the serpent in 3 verse 1, who seems to be kind of a chaos monster. And the garden the Garden of Eden is localized, and it is the place of God's presence. God's presence isn't everywhere. And you'll notice in Revelation 21 and following, 21 and 22, or is it just 21? Whatever it is, the new creation is missing things like the sea and the temple and the sun. Okay, that is to say, there's more to God's good creation than just Genesis 1. Human beings play a huge role in this, and why their sin messes up all of creation. Which then brings us to the image of God, which I always find fascinating, that people come up to all sorts of explanations for the image of God than what is right there smack in front, and where it's described in Genesis 1:26 through 28, where he says, hey, I'm going to create you in my image and likeness, therefore subdue, rule. Yes. So you can rule like God, or you can rule like philosophers do, and you can rule like kings do. You can rule like scientists do. You can rule like Adam and Cain and Lamech. Lamech is in chapter 4, important character. You can rule like the sons of God in chapter 6, who treat women like chattel. It uses the same phrase. We're going to get to this in a minute, where women are treated like property. Okay, you can rule like Nimrod, who was a mighty warrior in the face of Yahweh, and went out and raping and pillaging and murdering and plundering, because that's what warriors do, or at least they did back then. All right, so that's all about reading it as story. That is God's good creation, which humans were to be his image. And now let's look at some patterns that we can see. So the pattern of Adam and Eve as ruling and as priests. This is really hard to see. The ruling one is a little bit easier because he says, rule, have dominion, like God. The priestly role is a little hard to see, so pay attention to my notes in my translation from 1 and 2. I would say it's pretty clearly there. You'll see this with Noah when he offers sacrifices in chapter 9, I think it is. Abraham also plays something of a priestly role. That is this go-between between God and creation, that the king plays and that the priest plays, this intermediary between God and creation. So you have this idea of God establishing his kingdom, his palace, God establishing his temple, okay? The other pattern you're going to see is from one to many, one to many, one to many. So you're going to have Adam and Eve, the one, Adam and Eve, to the many, the sons of God, in chapter 6, you're going to have Noah, and then you're going to have Abraham as the one. We're going to get to this later when we get to David being the one. And then Jesus being the one. And so you got one to many, one to many, one to many. This repeated pattern that we begin in Genesis 1 and 2 is going to be repeated over and over and again through Scripture, that there's going to be this remnant that God saves. Paul talked about this in Romans, if you remember. There's a remnant God saves, and the remnant is for the purpose of saving the many. All right, one other pattern I'll point out here in 3 verse 6 is so huge. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And he, according to 3:17, he listened to the voice of his wife. You're going to find this pattern repeated, not in the exact same words, but you can almost do this with any story of rebellion in the Bible. I mean, you look at David and Bathsheba, and David looked and he saw that Bathsheba was good for not being his subject, not being one of his citizens, but she's good for satisfying and slaking his lust. And he took and he ate. That's me paraphrasing, but you kind of go, oh yeah, that's the story. Solomon, same thing. Solomon loved many foreign women. And so you're going to see this with the story of Cain. You're going to see this with the sons of God. It's a little hard to translate chapter 6 because Hebrew is different. But the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were, and the word is the same as good that we saw in Genesis 1, but it's translated attractive because it would just be weird to translate it as good, even though I would do that because that's how I translate. So looking for that pattern, but again, back to chapter 3, verse 6, she saw that the tree was good. Earlier, we had seen that God gave the trees. Look at 2 verse 9. God caused to grow from the ground every tree which is desirable in appearance and good for food. And he made the tree of life in the midst of the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And so we have this very issue, the pattern. We have this pattern repeated where the same phraseology, the same terminology, the same pattern of words is used repeatedly. And you got to pay attention to this because you're reading a story. And so the author is going to be repeating these phrases because God says, hey, this is good for food. And then Eve goes, hey, this thing that God said is good for death is good for food. And so you're going to find this repeated pattern. God says to Cain, for example, where's your brother? And Cain goes, I'm not his keeper. He's not my sheep. And I just scream out every time, no, he's not your sheep. He's your brother. Okay, so again, pay attention to the word patterns. This actually means paying attention and going, wait, where have I heard those words before? Because they're repeated, and they are repeated often, sometimes in slightly different ways. Moses did not write like I do, where I would be very intentional to go, I'm going to use this exact phraseology and keep repeating it. He'll just riff on the theme and, make some subtle changes, but use some key words there. All right, that's good stuff. Let me know if you have any other insights or what's important for your reading. All right, God's peace be with you. Amen.